Picture a hunting group moving through the tall grass of the African savanna, roughly 40,000 years ago. The hunters are quiet, reading wind direction, watching for movement. Most of them scan broadly, eyes moving across the horizon for anything out of place. One of them does something different. He stops. He crouches. He stares at a patch of ground that looks identical to every other patch of ground for 100 meters in any direction. The others wait. 30 seconds pass. Then he points and they see it. The compressed grass, the displaced soil, the faint marks of hoof pressure no more than 4 hours old. The animal they had been tracking all morning was real, was close, and now they know exactly which way it went. That hunter had none of the traits the group would have called dominance. No physical authority, no particular ease in a crowd, no talent for negotiation. He was the one who noticed things no one else noticed. He could sit perfectly still for an hour without discomfort, scanning a water source for the absence of birds rather than the presence of prey. He had memorized every animal trail, every rock formation, every seasonal shift in the landscape within a 30-kilometer radius, not because anyone asked him to, but because his mind collected systems the way the rest of the group collected firewood. For most of human history, that person was not a burden to the group. He was the reason the group ate. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The modern world has a specific way of talking about autism. It is a spectrum condition, something to be screened for and supported. And in many modern contexts, that support is real and matters. But the framing carries an assumption buried so deep that most people never examine it. That the autistic brain is a brain that is failing at what brains are supposed to do. That the difficulties with social convention, the sensory sensitivities, the preference for pattern and system over small talk and flexibility, are signs of something going wrong rather than something going differently. Penny Spikins at the University of York spent years researching exactly this assumption. Her work, developed across multiple studies and published in 2017, reached a conclusion that most people are not prepared for. The traits we now associate with autism, heightened sensory awareness, an extraordinary capacity for pattern recognition, the ability to sustain focus on a single system with a depth and duration that most brains simply cannot manage, those traits did not emerge in a world of open offices and standardized tests. They emerged in a world where reading the compressed grass correctly meant your family ate that night. The modern diagnosis maps those traits onto an environment the brain was never built for. Simon Baron-Cohen at Cambridge University has spent decades researching what he calls the systemizing brain. His work, published in depth in 2003, documented how many autistic minds approach the world as a series of systems governed by rules, patterns, and predictable sequences. A systemizing brain processes lawful patterns with extraordinary precision. In a hunter-gatherer environment where animal behavior, weather cycles, plant growth patterns, and terrain were the entire content of a person's working knowledge, that cognitive profile was the most valuable tool the group had access to. His research also identified something called hyper-systemizing, the tendency to detect regularities in the environment that most brains filter out as noise. A hyper-systemizing mind will find patterns in things that other people cannot perceive as having patterns at all. Archaeologists now believe this is precisely the cognitive signature behind some of the most carefully made artifacts in the early human record. The Blombos cave shell beads from South Africa, 75,000 years old, sorted by size and color with a precision that served no immediate survival purpose. The bone flute from Hohlefels in Germany, 40,000 years old, structurally sound enough that researchers could still play it. Both required someone to hold a consistent mental model of a complex system across dozens of hours of careful, isolated labor. These were not group projects. These were acts of sustained, individual focus that most brains cannot replicate. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. In 2007, neuroscientists Henry Markram and Camilla Markram at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology published a paper that changed how researchers understood the autistic sensory experience. They called it the intense world theory. Their central finding, supported by neurological data, was that autistic brains do not process less than typical brains. They process more. Sensory input that the typical brain filters before it reaches conscious awareness arrives in the autistic brain at full volume. Sound, light, texture, and environmental information all arrive simultaneously, unfiltered, at an intensity that most people never experience. On a modern street, in a fluorescent-lit office with 30 people all moving and speaking at once, that intensity is difficult to absorb. On an open savanna with wind in the grass and 4-hour-old tracks in the soil, it was the closest thing to a superpower the ancient world had to offer. Louis Liebenberg, a South African researcher, spent decades working alongside the Duxo and Gui-San people of the Kalahari. His work, collected in The Art of Tracking, published in 1990, documented something that appears consistently in the literature on expert trackers. The best among them do not describe their process as inference, they describe it as perception. A 4-hour-old track is not evidence they reason from. It is something they simply see, assembled from dozens of micro-details arriving simultaneously. The moisture content of disturbed soil, the angle of broken grass stems, the particular compression pattern that distinguishes a walking animal from a startled one. Liebenberg noted that expert trackers often struggle to explain how they know what they know. The information arrives faster than language can follow it. That is not a description of reasoning, that is a description of sensory processing so fine-grained that it operates below the threshold of conscious thought, delivering conclusions the way a note arrives in a musician's ear before the musician decides what to call it. Liebenberg argued that tracking at this level required a form of cognitive engagement that fell somewhere between perception and prediction, reading what is there while simultaneously modeling where the animal was going and how long ago it passed. Two systems running at once, with neither one slowing the other down. What the Markrams documented in a neuroscience laboratory and what Liebenberg documented in the Kalahari are descriptions of the same mechanism from two different directions. The autistic brain takes in more raw sensory data than the typical brain and processes it with greater resolution. A person whose nervous system registers every bent stem, every asymmetry in soil texture, every disruption in the ambient pattern of a familiar landscape is not experiencing information overload in a hunting context. They are experiencing the landscape as it actually is, in the full level of detail it contains, before the typical brain has decided which parts matter. In an environment where every detail was potentially the one that fed your family, that was not a disadvantage. That was the assignment. The same sensory system that makes a crowded grocery store overwhelming made a hunting territory readable in a way no other brain could achieve. The tracker who noticed the compressed grass was not picking up something subtle. For him, the sensory information was loud. He could not notice it. The question was whether the environment he was born into rewarded what his brain did naturally. Frank Marlowe's fieldwork with the Hadza people of Tanzania, conducted across nearly a decade of direct observation, documented something that appears consistently across studies of modern hunter-gatherer communities. The people considered most essential to the group were rarely the most socially dominant ones. They were the specialists, the person who had memorized the dry season water sources no one else tracked, the one who could identify a medicinal plant by the underside of its leaf at 50 paces, the one who would follow a wounded animal through 6 hours of afternoon heat without losing focus or patience. Researchers studying these communities consistently describe individuals who would, in a contemporary clinical setting, meet diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum conditions. Within their communities, those individuals were the indispensable ones, the people the group's survival was built around. That gap between indispensable and disordered does not live in the person. It lives in the distance between two very different worlds, and only one of them was built for the brain those people carry. Here is what is worth sitting with. If you have ever been told you notice too much, that you think too carefully about things other people do not think about at all, that your focus runs too deep, or your interest in systems feels excessive to the people around you, that social rules feel arbitrary while patterns feel self-evident, you are not experiencing a modern malfunction. You are running a cognitive architecture that was state-of-the-art for 290,000 years of human history. The difficulties are real, and they are real because the world changed faster than evolution could follow. But the brain that carries those traits kept the species alive through every famine, every dry season, and every predator that tried to end the story before it could begin. That is what this brain was for. The hunters who read the grass are gone. The tracks they followed have long since become dust. But the mind that noticed them is still here, still running, still picking up patterns in a world that mostly stopped asking for them. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.